Hi Alison, thanks for coming along and agreeing to go through this rather artificial process. You're an occupational physician and a clinical advisor at ACC, and I thought it would be really valuable to have your perspective on the little case study that we've just completed. What struck you about that decision? What were your thoughts on the decision?
It was it's an interesting scenario. When I read it, I was somewhat taken aback, I think, by the outcome. Just to recap, this is a case of lateral epicondylitis, which is a very common condition, and it occurred in an office context, so in an administration worker. And the pain started, and it was recalled that one day she had sat in a different chair and it had been a very busy time, and that was the association of the onset of the pain, which was due to the condition. And there was no doubt about the diagnosis, it's lateral epicondylitis. But really, when it came to the case study with the reviewer was a non-clinical person, and there were two opposing medical opinions about what could have caused the lateral epicondylitis. One opinion was that it was very unlikely to be due to keyboarding or to the circumstances at the time. And the other opinion was that it could be due to keyboarding and therefore was an injury that should have cover. Now, as I said, lateral epicondylitis is a very common condition, and it's inflammation around the outside of the elbow, and it is due to the tendons that are attached in your forearm that move your fingers and also that move your wrist. And there have been lots and lots of studies about lateral epicondylitis and what causes it. And lateral epicondylitis is no more common in the office-based or administration working population than it is in the general population. Lateral epicondylitis does have an association with frequent and very forceful and long duration exposures, such as hitting a ball with a tennis racket. But it doesn't have an association with little finger movements or using a computer mouse. So the problem was essentially that the reviewer thought that because there had been a bit more keyboarding on that particular day, that could have caused the lateral epicondylitis. But from a clinical perspective, that's just not plausible. The keyboarding didn't cause even a micro trauma at the lateral epicondyle, and so it didn't matter whether the person did 50% more keyboarding or 100% more keyboarding on any one day, it wouldn't cause lateral epicondylitis.
Right. Which makes the outcome kind of befuddling, really, but hindsight, a wonderful thing. What would you see that could have been done in hindsight better to actually get what we think perhaps the right outcome would have been in that matter?
Well, I think there were three aspects here. There was one opinion that expressed, although I think rather obscurely, but did express that lateral epicondylitis is not caused by keyboarding and computer mouse. Then there was a conflicting medical opinion that it could be, but that was relying on some very old literature, from decades ago, and didn't acknowledge the much more the more recent research. And thirdly, that I think there had been some internal opinion from ACC which didn't necessarily sort of clarify that either. And although they looked at it as a gradual process injury, which is of course the one where you do something associated with work which causes an injury, usually over a long period of time, but there are three parts to getting cover under gradual process. One is that your occupation involves the activity which is injurious. Secondly, that activity does not take part to any material extent in your non-work life. And thirdly, that occupational group is recognised as being at higher risk of that injury. And of course, in the case of an office worker, those three parts can't be satisfied in terms of plausible medical cause for the injury. But once it had been looked at as gradual process, I don't think that the two conflicting medical opinions were sufficiently evaluated, and it wasn't made clear for a layperson about what the somewhat obscure clinical arguments were. And
Right.
I think that does happen sometimes.
We really need to spell it out in black and white and have it on paper for a reviewer.
I think so. I think that a specialist medical opinion can sometimes be a little bit too detailed or a little bit too expressed too obscurely for a layperson to pick out what are the essential sort of highlights.
There was some discussion about the diagnosis of epicondylitis and the fact that it could arise acutely. But then there was no real analysis of the sorts of forces or types of work that might be required to cause that. Would that be fair?
I think that is fair, and that's true for lots of conditions, that the research has shown that the scale of the degree of force that is required to be involved, the rate of repetition of the action, or the duration over time of the exposure, or the posture that that needs to be adopted. Because of course with these sorts of conditions, you're really only dealing with internal forces, not external forces. Wiggling your fingers around isn't really an external force.
Very good point.
Whereas gripping or hitting something with an impact, like for example a hammer or tennis racket, that is, forceful and can cause microtrauma. But also these degenerative conditions eventually often do become symptomatic, but not necessarily with any acute preceding event. But it's natural for somebody whose elbow has just become sore to cast about for why it has started now, and perhaps think that some unusual or extra activity that they had undertaken was in fact the cause.
Sure. I don't know whether it's particularly relevant or even worth mentioning, but I did find it intriguing that the analysis of her work tasks or her workstation sort of indicated that on the given day that was finally determined to be the cause of this epicondylitis, technically what she was doing was more correct than what she had done previously. So, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, or is that something of a red herring?
Well, I noted that too, and I do think it is somewhat of a red herring. It's, I think, work ergonomics, although the theory of it overall is that your chair needs to be this high and your feet need to be that low and your knees need to be there and your wrists there and your keyboard. But in actual fact, we all have a sort of a personal comfort zone and posture, and any change from that, so this person had been sitting in someone else's chair on that day, and that can sometimes be perceived by the person as uncomfortable. However, that's not an accident, and it doesn't cause an injury. Sitting in a different chair doesn't cause an injury. And similarly, as I say, keying is not injurious, and doing more keying than normal is not an accident and can't cause an injury. If the activity is not inherently injurious, then doing it more doesn't cause an injury.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alison. Thanks for
Thanks,
your
Tim.
time.